Hi, so I'm going to read some more of The Plague, even though it's really late. I didn't do anything yesterday, and I slept all day, so here I am to read part 3 in the middle of the night. Part 3. So, week by week, the prisoners of Plague put up what fight they could. Some, like Rambert, even contrived to fancy they were still behaving as free men and had the power of choice. But actually, it would have been truer to say that by this time, in August, the plague had swallowed up everything and everyone. No longer were there individual destinies, only a collective destiny, made of plague and the emotions shared by all. Strongest of these emotions was a sense of exile and deprivation, with all the cross-currents of revolt and fear set up by those. This is why the narrator thinks that this moment, registering the climax of the summer heat and of the disease, was best for describing on general lines and by way of illustration the excess of the living, burials of the dead, and the plight of parted lovers. It was at this time that a high wind rose and blew for several days through the plague-stricken city. Wind is particularly dreaded by the inhabitants of Oran, since the plateau on which the town is built presents no natural obstacle, and it can sweep the streets with unimpeded violence. During the months when not a drop of rain had refreshed the town, a gray crust had formed on everything, and this flaked off under the wind, disintegrating into dust and clouds. What with the dust and scraps of paper whirled against people's legs, the streets grew emptier. Those few who went out could be seen hurrying along, bent forward with handkerchiefs or their hands pressed to their mouth. At nightfall, instead of the usual throng of people, each trying to prolong a day that might well be their last, you met only small groups hastening home or to a favorite cafe. With the result that for several days when twilight came, it fell much quicker this time of the year. The streets were almost empty, and silent except for long-drawn stridences of wind. The smell of brine and seaweed came from the unseen, storm-tossed ocean, and in the growing darkness the almost empty town, palled with dust, swept by bitter sea spray, and loud with the shrilling of the wind, seemed to be a lost island of the damned. Until now the plague had found far more victims in the thickly populated and less well-appointed outer districts than in the heart of town. But suddenly, however, it launched a new attack and established itself in the business center. Residents accused the wind of carrying infection, broadcasting germs, as the hotel manager put it. Whatever the reason might be, people living in the central district realized that their turn had come, when each night they heard more and more often the ambulances clanging past, sounding the plague's dismal, passionless voice under their windows. The authorities had the idea of segregating certain particularly affected central areas and permitting only those whose services were indispensable to cross the cordon. Dwellers in those districts could not help regarding these regulations as a sort of taboo, specially directed at themselves, and so they came, by contrast, to envy the residents in other areas their freedom. And the latter, to cheer themselves up in despondent moments, fell to picturing the lot of those who were less free than themselves. Anyhow, there are some worse off than we are, was a remark that voiced the only solace to be had in those days. About the same time, we had a recurrence of outbreaks of fire, especially in the residential areas near the West Gate. It was found, after an inquiry, that people who had returned from quarantine were responsible for these fires. Thrown off balance by bereavement, grief, and anxiety, they were burning their houses under the delusion that they were killing off the plague. Great difficulty was experienced in fighting the fires, whose numbers and frequency exposed whole districts to constant danger, owing to the high wind. When the attempts made by the authorities to convince these people that the official fumigation of the house effectively removed any risk of infection had proved unavailing, it became necessary to decree a very heavy penalty for this type of arson. And most likely it was not the prospect of imprisonment that deterred these unhappy people, but the common belief that a sentence of imprisonment was tantamount at this time to a death sentence, owing to the very high mortality rate prevailing in the town jail. It must be admitted that there was foundation for this belief. It seemed like, for obvious reasons, the plague launched its most virulent attacks on those who lived, by choice or necessity, in groups: soldiers, prisoners, monks, and nuns. For though some prisoners are kept solitary, a prison forms a sort of community, as is proved by the fact that in the town jail the guards died of plague in the same proportion as the prisoners. The plague was no respecter of persons, and under its despotic rule everyone, from the warden down to the humblest delinquent, was under sentence, and, perhaps for the first time, impartial justice reigned in the prison. Attempts made by authorities to redress this leveling out by some sort of hierarchy. The idea was to confer a decoration on guards who had died in the exercise of their duties, came to nothing. Since natural law had been declared, and the guards might, from a certain angle, be regarded as on active service, they were awarded posthumously a military medal. But though the prisoners raised no protest, strong exception was taken in military circles, and it was pointed out, logically enough, that a most regrettable confusion in the public mind would certainly ensue. The civil authority conceded the point and decided that the simplest solution was to bestow on the guards who had died at their post a plague medal. Even so, as regards the first recipients of the military medal, the harm had already been done, and there was no question of taking away this decoration from them, so the military were still unsatisfied. And what's more, the plague medal had a disadvantage. It had far less moral effect than attaching to a military award, since in time of pestilence a decoration of this sort is too easily acquired. So nobody was satisfied. Another difficulty was that the jail administration could not follow the procedure adopted by the religious and, to a less degree, the military authorities. The monks in the monasteries of the town had been evacuated and were lodging for the time being with religious-minded families. In the same way, wherever possible, small bodies of men had been moved out of military barracks and lived in schools or public buildings. So the disease, which apparently had forced on us the solidarity of a beleaguered town, disrupted at the same time long-established communities and sent men out to live as individuals in relative isolation. This, too, added to the feeling of unrest. Indeed, it can be easily imagined that these changes, combined with a high wind, had also an incendiary effect on certain minds. There were frequent attacks on the gates of the town, and the men who made them now were armed. Shots were exchanged, there were casualties, and a few even got away. So the sentry posts were reinforced, and these attempts quickly ceased. However, they sufficed to start a wave of revolutionary violence, though only on a small scale. Houses that had been burnt or closed by the sanitary control were looted, and it seemed unlikely that these excesses were premeditated. Usually it was a chance incentive that led normally well-behaved people to acts which promptly had their imitators. So you sometimes saw a man, acting on a crazy impulse, run into a blazing house under the eyes of its owner, who was standing there, dazed with grief, watching the flames. Seeing his indifference, onlookers would follow the lead given by the first man, and pretty soon the dark street was full of running men, changed into hunched, misshapen gnomes by the flickering glow from the dying flames and the ornaments of furnishings that they carried on their shoulders. It was incidents of this sort that compelled the authorities to declare martial law and enforce the regulations deriving from it. 2 looters were shot, but we may doubt if this made much impression on any others. With so many deaths taking place every day, these 2 executions went unnoticed, a mere drop in the ocean. Actually, scenes of this kind continued to take place fairly often, without the authorities making even a show of intervening. The only regulation that seemed to have some effect on the populace was the establishment of curfew hour and the restriction of social duties. From 11 onwards, plunged in complete darkness, Oran seemed like a huge necropolis. On moonlight nights, the long, straight streets and dirty white walls, nowhere darkened by the shadow of a tree, their peace untroubled by footsteps or a dog's bark, glimmered in pale recession. The city was silent, and no more than an assemblage of huge inert cubes, between which only the mute effigies of men, in bronze, with blank stone or metal faces, conjured up a sorry semblance of what may have been. In lifeless squares and avenues, these tawdry idols lorded it over the lowering sky, solid monsters that might have personified the rule of immobility imposed on us, or that of a defunct city in which plague, stone, and darkness had effectively silenced every voice. But there was darkness also in men's hearts, and the true facts were as little calculated to reassure our townsfolk as the wild stories going round about burials. The narrator must discuss these burials, and a word of excuse is here in place, for he is well aware of the reproach that might be made him in this respect. His justification is that funerals were taking place throughout this period, and in a way he was compelled, as everybody was compelled, to give heed to them. In any case, it should not be assumed that he has morbid taste for these ceremonies, and prefers sea bathing. But the bathing beaches were out of bounds, and the company of the living ran a huge risk, increasing as the days went by, of converting one into the company of the dead. This was self-evident. So one could always refuse to face this disagreeable fact, shut your eyes to it, or thrust it out of mind. But there is a terrible cogency in the self-evident. Ultimately, it will break down all defenses. How, for instance, to continue to ignore funerals on the day when somebody you know needed one? Actually, the most striking feature of the funerals was the speed. Formalities were whittled down, and generally speaking, all ceremonial was suppressed. Plague victims died away from their family, and the customary vigil beside the dead body was forbidden, with the result that a person dying in the evening spent the entire night alone, and those who died in the daytime were buried very quickly. Needless to say, families were notified, but in most cases, since the deceased had lived with them, the members were in quarantine and thus immobilized. When, however, the deceased had not lived with family, they were permitted to attend at a fixed time after the body had been put into a coffin and when the journey to the cemetery was about to begin. Let us suppose that these formalities were taking place at the auxiliary hospital, of which Dr. Ryu was in charge. This converted school had an exit at the back of the main building. A large storeroom giving on the corridor contained coffins. On arrival, the family found a coffin already nailed up in this corridor. The most important part of the business was the signing of official forms by the head of the family. Then the coffin was loaded onto a motor vehicle, either a hearse or a large converted ambulance. The mourners stepped into one of the few taxis still allowed to run, and the vehicles drove hell for leather to the cemetery by a route which avoided the center of the town. They would halt at the gate, where police officers applied a rubber stamp to the official exit permit, without which it was impossible for citizens to have what they called a last resting place. Policemen stood back, and the cars drew up near a plot of ground where a number of graves stood open waiting for their inmates. A priest often came to meet the mourners, since church services for funerals were now prohibited. To an accompaniment of several prayers, the coffin was dragged from the hearse, roped up, carried to the graveside, slipped, and came heavily to rest at the bottom of the hole. No sooner had the priest begun to sprinkle holy water than the first dirt rebounded from the lid. The ambulance would have already left, and was being sprayed with disinfectant. And while clay thudded more and more dully on the rising layer of earth, the family were bundling into the taxi. 15 minutes later, they would be at home. The whole process was put through with the maximum speed and the minimum risk. It cannot be denied that in the early days, the natural feelings of families were outraged by these lightning-fast funerals. But obviously, in time of plague, sentiment can't be taken into account. Everything must be sacrificed to efficiency. And though, to start with, the morale of the population was shaken by this procedure, for the desire to have a proper funeral is more widespread than generally believed, as time went on, fortunately enough, the food problem became more urgent, and the thoughts of the townsfolk were diverted to more instant needs. So much energy was expended on filling out forms, hunting for supplies, and lining up that people had no time to think of the way in which others were dying all around them, and which they themselves would likely die very soon. So the growing complications of everyday life, which might otherwise have been an affliction, proved to be a blessing in disguise. Indeed, had not the epidemic, as already mentioned, spread its ravages, all would have been for the best. Because, at this time, coffins became scarcer. There was a shortage of winding sheets and space in the cemetery. Something had to be done about this, and the obvious step, justified by practical convenience, was to combine funerals and, when necessary, multiply the trips between the hospital and the burial place. At one moment, the stock of coffins in Ryu's hospital was reduced to 5. Once filled, all 5 were loaded together into an ambulance. At the cemetery, they were emptied at once, and the iron-gray corpses put on stretchers and deposited in a shed reserved for this purpose, to wait their turn. The empty coffins, after being sprayed with antiseptic fluid, were rushed back to the hospital, and the process was repeated as often as necessary throughout the day and night. This system worked very well and won the approval of the prefect. He even told Dr. Ryu that it was a really great improvement on the death carts, which till now had been driven by the Negroes of the town, of which one reads in accounts of former visitations of this sort. Dr. Ryu said yes, and though the burials are much the same, we must keep careful records of them. That would be the progress. Successful, however, as the system proved itself in practice, there was something so distasteful in the last rites as now performed that the prefect felt constrained to forbid relations of the deceased being present at ceremonies. They were allowed to come only as far as the cemetery gates, and even that was not officially authorized, because things had changed as regards the last stages of a funeral. In a patch of open ground dotted with lentiscus trees at the far end of the cemetery, 2 giant pits had been dug, one for the men, the other for women. In this respect, the authorities still gave thought to some propriety, and it was only later that, by the force of things, this last remnant of decorum went by the board, and men and women were flung into the death pits indiscriminately. Happily, this ultimate indignity synchronized with the plague's last ravages. In the period we are now concerned with, the separation of the sexes in the grave pits was still in force, and the authorities set great store by it. At the bottom of each pit, a deep layer of quicklime steamed and seethed. On the lips of each pit, a low ridge of quicklime threw up bubbles that burst into the air above it. When the ambulances had finished trips for the day, the stretchers were carried to the pits, one by one. The naked, somewhat contorted bodies were slid into the pit, side by side, then covered with a layer of quicklime and another of earth. The earth only a few inches deep, just enough to leave space for the next consignment. On the following day, the next of kin were asked to sign the register of burials, which showed the distinction that can be made between men and, for example, dogs. Men's deaths are entered and checked up. Obviously, all these activities called for considerable staff, and Ryu was often on the brink of a shortage of people. Many of the grave diggers, stretcher bearers, and the like, public servants to begin with, and later volunteers, died of plague as well. However stringent the precautions, sooner or later the contagion would do its work. Still, when all is said and done, the really amazing thing is that as long as the epidemic lasted, there was never any real lack of people to do these duties. The critical moment came just before the outbreak touched its high water mark, when the doctor had good reason for feeling anxious. There was a real shortage of manpower for the higher posts and the rough work, as Ryu called it. Paradoxically enough, once the whole town was in the grip of the disease, its very prevalence tended to make things easier, since the disorganization of the economic life of the town threw a great number of people out of work. Few of the workers made available were qualified for administrative posts, but recruiting men for rough work became much easier. From now on, indeed, poverty showed itself a stronger stimulus than fear, especially owing to its risks. Such work was highly paid. The sanitary authorities had a long waiting list of applicants. Whenever there was a vacancy, the men at the top of the list were notified, and unless they too had died, they never failed to appear when summoned. Thus, the prefect, who had always been reluctant to employ the prisoners in the jail, whether short-term men or lifers, was able to avoid recourse to this distasteful and disgusting measure. As long, he said, as there are unemployed, prisoners can afford to wait. And so, until the end of August, our fellow citizens could be conveyed to their last resting place, if not in decorous conditions, at least in a manner orderly enough for the authorities to feel they were doing their duty by the dead and the bereaved. However, here we anticipate a little, and must describe the pass to which we came in the final phase. From August onwards, the plague mortality was, and continued such as far as to exceed the capacity of the cemetery itself. Such expedients as knocking down walls, allowing the dead to encroach on neighboring land, proved inadequate. Some new method had to be evolved without delay. The first step taken was to bury the dead by night, which permitted a more summary procedure. The bodies were piled as is into ambulances in larger and larger numbers. And the few belated wayfarers who, in defiance of the regulations, were out in the outlying districts after curfew hour, or whose duties took them there, often saw long white ambulances hurtling past. The corpses were then tipped pell-mell into the pits, and had hardly settled into place when spadefuls of quicklime began to sear their faces, in holes dug steadily deeper as time went on. Shortly afterwards, however, it became necessary to find a new space and strike out in a new direction. By a special urgency measure, the denizens of Grants in perpetuity were evicted from their graves, and the exhumed remains dispatched to the crematorium. And soon the plague victims likewise had to go to their fiery end. This meant that the old crematorium east of the town, outside the gates, had to be utilized. Accordingly, the East Gate sentry post was moved further out. And then, a municipal employee had an idea that helped the harassed authorities. He advised them to simply use the streetcar line that ran along the coastal road, which was now unused. The interior of streetcars and trailers were adapted to this new purpose, and a branch line was laid down to the crematorium, which thus became a terminus. During the late summer and throughout the autumn, daily you could see, moving along the road, skirting the cliffs above the sea, a strange procession of empty-appearing streetcars swaying against the skyline. The residents in this area soon learned what was going on, and though the cliffs were patrolled day and night, groups of people contrived to thread their way unseen between the rocks and would toss flowers into the open trailers as the cars went by. And in the warm darkness of the summer nights, the cars could be heard clanking on their way, laden with flowers and corpses. During the first few days, an oily, foul-smelling cloud of smoke was low on the eastern district of the town. These effluvia, doctors agreed, although unpleasant, were not in the least contagious. However, the residents of this part of town threatened to migrate in a body, convinced that germs were raining down on them from the sky, with the result that an elaborate apparatus for diverting the smoke was installed to appease them. After this, only when a strong wind was blowing did the sickly odor coming from the east remind them that they were living under a new order, and that the plague fires were taking their nightly toll. These were the consequences of the epidemic at its culminating point. Happily, it grew no worse than this. Otherwise, it may well be believed that the resourcefulness of the administration, the officials, and the town, not to mention the burning capacity of the crematorium, would have proved unequal to its task. Dr. Ryu knew that desperate solutions had been mooted, such as simply throwing corpses into the sea, and a picture had risen before him of hideous jetsam lolling in the shadows under the cliffs. He knew also that if there was another rise in the death rate, no organization, however efficient, could stand up to it, that men would die in heaps, corpses would rot in the streets, whatever the authorities might do, and that the town would see in public squares the dying embrace the living in the frenzies of an all-too-comprehensible hatred or some crazy hope. Such were the sights and apprehensions that kept alive in our townspeople their feeling of exile and separation. In this connection, the narrator is well aware how regrettable it is his inability to record at this point something of a really spectacular order, a heroic feat or a memorable deed like those that thrill us in the chronicles of history. The truth is, nothing is less sensational than pestilence, and by reason of their very duration, great misfortunes are monotonous. In the memories of those who lived through them, the grim days of plague do not stand out like vivid flames, beaconing a troubled sky, but rather like the slow, deliberate progress of some monstrous thing crushing out all upon its path. The real plague had nothing in common with the grandiose imaginings that had haunted Dr. Ryu's mind at the beginning. It was about all a shrewd, unflagging adversary, a skilled organizer, doing its work thoroughly, well, and slowly. That, it may be said in passing, is why, as not to play false to facts, and still more as not to play false to himself, this narrator has aimed to be objective. He has made hardly any changes for the sake of artistic effect. And in deference to this scruple, he is constrained to admit that although the chief source of distress, the deepest as well as the most widespread, was separation, and it is his duty to say more about it as it existed in the later stages of the plague, it cannot be denied that even this distress was coming to lose something of its poignancy. Was it that fellow citizens, even those who had felt the parting from their loved ones most deeply, were getting used to doing without them? To assume this would fall short of the truth. It would be more correct to say that they were wasting away emotionally as well as physically. At the beginning of the plague, people had a vivid recollection of absent ones and bitterly felt their loss. But though they could clearly recall the face, smile, and voice of their beloved, and an occasion or two when they had been supremely happy, they had trouble picturing what they might be doing in that moment when they conjured up these memories, in a setting so hopelessly remote. In short, at these moments memory played its part, but their imagination failed them. During the second phase of the plague, their memory would fail them too. Not that they had forgotten the face itself, but it had lost its substance, and they no longer saw it in memory's mirror. Thus, while during the first weeks people were apt to complain that only shadows remained to them of what their love had been and meant, they now came to learn that even shadows can disappear, losing the hues of life that memory gives. And by the end of their long sundering, they had also lost the power of imagining the intimacy that once was theirs, or understanding what it can be to live with someone whose life is wrapped up with yours. In this respect, they had adapted themselves to the very condition of plague, all the more potent for its mediocrity. And at that point, I'm going to stop for the night. Hopefully I can save this and I don't lose it. And I'm reading The Plague by Albert Camus. Lisa. It's really, really good. All of the videos of me reading this from the beginning up until now are all on my YouTube channel. I linked the video section in my bio. So if you go to my bio on Instagram here and click on it, it just links straight to my videos. And you can start at the beginning and listen along, or you can just pick up a copy yourself and read it. It's really good. So that's part of part 3. The beginning of part 3. Things are starting to get really bad. And I think I will try to read more tomorrow. I don't know, today and yesterday I was very unmotivated, obviously, but I'll try to read some more tomorrow, and everybody be safe. Do what you can. Do what you gotta do. Get through it. Repetition.